hard to find anyone who has not heard the often repeated claim that humans and chimpanzees are genetically 98 to 99% identical. This has been promoted to the world as proof that humans share a common evolutionary ancestor with chimps. However, recent studies now challenge this claim.
Evolutionary geneticists have acknowledged that the actual genetic differences are far greater than we've been told. For example, primate evolutionist Todd Prius states, "It is now clear that the genetic differences between humans and chimpanzees are far more extensive than previously thought. Their genomes are not 98% or 99% identical." Earlier studies published in the evolutionary scientific literature reported an overall DNA similarity of 98 to 99%. However, large portions of the chimp genome did not align with the human genome, and so were excluded from the reported estimates. For instance, the algorithm parameters used in the major milestone publication in Nature reported by the Chimpanzee Sequencing and Analysis Consortium omitted over 100 million DNA letters. When accounting for these large non-alignable regions and other omitted sequence data, the actual chimp-human DNA similarity is significantly lower than the 98 to 99% identity claims.
When they originally started to ask that question, they didn't have full genomic data, and so they're actually based their estimates of similarity based upon just little snippets of the genome. And they were choosing protein coding sequences which are the most similar, that explain why we have similar biochemistry. So initially we're saying, 98, 99% of the genomes must be similar between chimp and human. The textbooks still say that, but basically geneticists know that's not correct.
What is the actual genetic difference between humans and chimpanzees? This is a question that comes up over and over again in this creation-evolution debate. And if it is true we're 98 to 99% genetically identical to the closest evolutionary relatives, evolutionists say, it feels like they're just kissing cousins. Well, let's dig down into what the scientific data actually say. If you look at the 2005 chimpanzee genome paper in Nature, you look at subsequent papers, the bonobo paper, the gorilla paper, the orangutan paper, all of them give basically a consistent answer. That most of our DNA can be aligned to chimpanzee and vice versa, and in that region that does align, it's about 1 to 2% different in terms of single letter differences. But if you say, wait a minute, are there sections of human DNA that fail to align to chimpanzee? Are there sections of chimpanzee that fail to align to human? The answer is yes, and it's far more DNA than is that 1 to 2% different. So if you incorporate all of these numbers together, the stuff that aligns and is almost identical, the stuff that can't be aligned at all, you get a number about 85%. What's even more important is what that percentage translates to in terms of absolute differences. So in 85% identity, 15% difference in terms of raw DNA letters represents 300 to 400 million single DNA letter differences. That's a massive number.
The evolutionary theory claims that humans evolved from a hypothetical chimp-like ancestor roughly 6 million years ago. This is said to have occurred through a long series of beneficial mutations. In light of the actual genomic differences between humans and chimps, this is simply not genetically feasible. A more accurate chimp-human DNA similarity estimate of 85% represents 300 to 400 million DNA letter differences, an extreme level of genetic discontinuity. This means in order to evolve a chimp-like ancestor into modern humans, hundreds of millions of beneficial mutations need to arise in an ancestral population. The difficulty with accomplishing this has to do with the extremely long waiting time required for establishing even the smallest sets of mutually dependent mutations. Even granting a best-case scenario for evolution by generously assuming human and chimp DNA is 99% identical, the remaining 1% would still be a difference of 30 million DNA letters, an impossible genetic barrier for evolution to traverse in 6 million years.
Let's assume that it's still only 1%. That's not correct. No one believes that now. But even if to get 1% of the genome different requires 30 million mutations, that's a lot of new information. And when we talked about the waiting time, we were saying, well, 8 mutations, waiting for 8 specific mutations takes more time than the time since the Big Bang. So no, it's not conceivable. You cannot change the program of an ape into the programming for a human in any amount of time. People ask, well, what's the problem? You're saying there's 100 new mutations per person per generation in a big population. That's billions of mutations every generation. What's the problem with getting the information that codes for something? Well, the difference is that genetic damage is non-specific. So deleterious mutations can happen in anywhere in the genome. There's no specificity. So creating damage is easy, but in the case of a manuscript or a genetic program or a computer program, it's easy to break them by changing letters. It's really hard to improve them. And you have to wait a really long time for the specific letter to mutate into the specific alternative letter at a specific site to actually create any type of benefit. So waiting time for beneficials is different from waiting time for neutrals. You don't have to wait long for a neutral or for a deleterious. You have to wait a really, really long time if you're waiting for a specific and beneficial one.
Waiting for the right mutations to arise and become established in a pre-human population greatly exceeds evolutionary timescales. Leading evolutionary geneticists acknowledge it is a serious problem for the theory, devastating for the ape-to-man scenario. Population geneticist Michael Lynch confesses in the Journal of Molecular Biology and Evolution. A central problem in the evolutionary theory concerns the mechanisms by which adaptations requiring multiple mutations emerge in natural populations. Lynch's calculations suggest the length of time required for just 2 specific mutations to become established in a pre-human population is over 200 million years, well beyond the 6 million year time span during which an ape-like creature is said to have evolved into man. Other studies reporting in scientific literature show similar results. Evolutionary geneticists Durrett and Schmidt of Cornell University report in the Annals of Applied Probability that the average waiting time to form a slightly longer DNA sequence of 8 specific mutations is on the order of 650 million years. But this estimate is incomplete. When accounting for random loss due to a well-established principle known as genetic drift, the actual waiting time should be 100-fold longer, roughly 65 billion years. This is 4 times longer than the reputed age of the universe, assuming a Big Bang singularity 13.7 billion years ago. At best, all evolution can hope to accomplish in the prescribed 6 million year time span is the formation of a tiny DNA sequence, no more than a few genetic letters in length, totally incapable of producing a single new gene. Modern genetics has demonstrated that it is impossible for humans to have evolved from a chimp-like ancestor via random mutations. It is an unbridgeable genetic gap for evolution to traverse, even given billions of years.